50 degrees and bright sunshine. Yes. Probably you right.
There have been a major like that.
I've been talking your wife and. Yeah.
Well, what they did was this thing came
I'm gonna do, I'm gonna do my trip to Venice, to see Anali in the last. Maybe I should do it on Zoom too. Eh?
Oh, look at the dude here. Ooh, sweet.
It's the one that's coming up. But I gotta get the class in by May. Not going till Venice till June. Lots of pictures and show all the art. I was thinking that they had said that they were gonna back up and not do Zoom anymore and all. I guess they're continuing. They know how to do it. It's working well.
Some people used to not do
Yeah. Right, exactly. There's been a few times that I've been traveling. You can travel when you're Chattanooga. You spend the morning with us.
Looks like it kind of movement that would be.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's just gone 10 o'clock, so I figure we'll get started. My name is Suzanne Pilar Birch, as it says there on the screen, and I'm an associate professor here at UGA. I have a joint appointment in the Department of Anthropology and the Department of Geography. My interest is in reconstructing past human environment interactions, how people manipulated the ecosystem, interacted with animals, to better adapt to changing environmental conditions. And my particular interest in my research has been the development of agriculture, so the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. I direct the Quaternary Isotope Paleoecology Lab, which is sort of a mouthful, but the acronym is QUIP, so that's fun. And we basically analyze teeth, bones, shells, plants, and even water isotopically. So we look at the chemical compositions to better understand what the environmental conditions were. I also direct the internship at our Museum of Natural History here on campus. It's an undergraduate internship. I have about 50 undergrads come through every year working in the different collections. About a year and a half ago, I partnered with the Great Courses to create this course, Early Humans, Ice Stone, and Survival. So it's actually a 20-episode series. The episodes are between 20 minutes to a half an hour each. So this is about 10 hours of content in hopefully about an hour or less. So you're getting sort of the condensed version. I also recently signed on with Smithsonian Journeys to serve as an expert on their travel. And so I'll be going to the caves in France and Spain, the Paleolithic caves, Lascaux and Chauvet and all those sorts of places, talking about cave art. And then also another trip where we'll go to some of the premier World Heritage sites around the world later this year. So I'm looking forward to doing that and sharing my expertise in that way.
When are you doing the caves?
May. Yeah. So yeah, right after the semester ends, I'll be jetting off to fieldwork as well. So today I hope to kind of give you a taste of, over 2.5 million years of human history, again, in less than an hour now. I've been a professor here at UGA 9 years, almost 10 now. And when I teach, I usually start my classes in archaeology by asking students, if they can name, what are the names of their parents? What are the names of their grandparents? And of course, pretty much everybody can do that. But when we get to great grandparents, sometimes it's already at that level a little tricky for them to name, all of them. If I ask great great grandparents, pretty much forget about it. And I doubt most of us in this room could also name all of our great great grandparents. And the reason I, bring that up is to just demonstrate, right, how quickly knowledge is lost, just a few generations. And that's just their names. That's nothing about them, what their likes or dislikes were, what they did in their life, how they lived and experienced the world. So today we're going much further back to our earliest ancestors and, hopefully discuss this distant but sometimes elusive past. And so I'm going to be talking about some of the methods and ways that we do this, in addition to, the sort of facts as we understand them now, our best understanding about what happened in the past and how we know it through archaeology, and in particular, the development of archaeological science these days. We're using scientific methods more than ever before. The Society for American Archaeology defines archaeology as the study of ancient and recent human past through material remains. And as part of this mission statement, the Society advises that all human remains should be treated with dignity and respect. And so I just like to let everybody know, during our time together today, we'll be meeting some of our ancient ancestors face to face. So there will be depictions of human remains. And so just to be advised in case, you find that disturbing, I just wanted to let you know. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Oh, doesn't want to advance. Here we go. Okay. So our species, Homo sapiens, is believed to have emerged in East Africa in what is now Ethiopia, there on the map. But some of the earliest hominin fossils on record also come from Ethiopia in the Middle Awash region. This is where archaeologists discovered one of humanity's first ancestors, the fossil Lucy, pictured here. And she belongs to a species known as Australopithecus afarensis, which existed nearly 3.2 million years ago. Like us, Lucy walked upright but did not use tools, and she stood only about 3 feet tall. Around 3 million years after Lucy, 2 Homo sapiens adults and a 7-year-old child also lived and died in the same part of Ethiopia. Their remains became fossilized in a geological formation that's estimated to be about 160,000 years old. They stood taller than her, they had larger brains, in much more rounded skulls, and notably, they also used stone tools. Further south, between the Omo and Kibish rivers there, also in Ethiopia, 2 other individuals lived and died slightly earlier, about 195,000 years ago. They also have a large dome-shaped skull, tall stature, and use stone tools. And so this group of fossils dating between 160 to 195,000 years ago are the oldest commonly accepted examples of our species. Today, we've replaced our stone tools with smartphones, which we use to communicate around the world in a matter of seconds or fly somewhere in a matter of hours. But between the time that our species first emerged in about 200,000 years ago and the earliest agricultural societies developed 10,000 years ago, we made it to the furthest reaches of Eurasia, sailed to Australia, and crossed the land bridge into the Americas. It was truly an amazing journey, just this very short amount of time, relatively speaking. But how did we, as a small and relatively defenseless primate, adapt to such diverse environments around the world? Some of these answers can be explored through looking at the origins of tool use, symbolic behavior, migration and mobility, social organization, and the beginnings of food production. So we'll briefly touch on all of these today. Okay, so
I have a question.
yeah,
Between that 3 million year-old fossil
Mhm.
and 200,000. Were hominids living in that same area continuously?
We have good evidence throughout Eastern Africa and also North Africa and Southern Africa, actually. So, yeah,
So
but
there-
they're
in that valley, there would have been our ancestors living that whole time.
mhm.
Ah, cool.
So, but what distinguishes us, Homo sapiens, from those other earlier specimens, right? There's many steps in between that Australopithecus afarensis and Homo sapiens. So again, I ask my students, they come up with these ideas. What could it be? Is it walking on 2 feet? Is it, stone tools? Is it language? Language is one of the first requirements that comes to mind when I ask my students, but language actually probably didn't arise until much later, maybe a few 100,000 years ago. Walking upright is another popular guess, but even Lucy did that, so that's further back in time. It's not making us really us. Opposable thumbs, other primates also have opposable thumbs. An omnivorous diet, differentiated, teeth. These are all sort of ancestral traits. So what really sets us apart is our brain. Growing relatively larger as first our genus Homo and then our species branched away from, the sort of trunk of the tree. It's likely that this larger brain size played a role in the adaptability of the first of our ancestors to be considered part of the genus Homo, which was Homo habilis. It was able to survive in a variety of locations across Eastern Africa, navigating a variety of different environmental conditions and climate shifts over about 1 million years worth of time. And these were skills that would serve us well throughout the rest of the dispersal throughout the world. Homo habilis's brain made up less than 2% of its body weight, and metabolically consumed about 20% of its available energy. But that was an increase, even though it doesn't maybe sound like that much, 2% of its body weight, right? That was an increase of about 50% over Lucy. So Homo habilis is thought to have existed from between 2.5 to 1.4 million years ago. And this was followed or overlapped with Homo erectus from about 1.8 million years ago through to about 100,000 years ago. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Homo sapiens emerged around 200,000 years ago. So there's some overlap as well. So this far back, really, bones and stones are our only evidence that we have for understanding behavior. So the major research focus tends to be on what these individuals ate and how they hunted it. So in terms of the bones, it's argued that meat would have been very important in the diet and that eating large amounts helped to grow proportionally larger brains. But secondly, the advent of stone tools is really interesting to consider because the creation of stone tools requires forethought. You have to have the cognitive ability to see what you're going to make before it emerges, like a sculptor shaping a lump of clay. The stone comes from the rock. So it's likely that stone tool production was so important that individuals likely had home ranges that were based around the stone resource, the raw material resource that they could access on a regular basis. So for a long time, it was thought that this combination of larger brain size and stone tool production was really a keystone in the development of our species. However, in 2015, which is almost 10 years ago now, hard to believe, I keep saying recently, but a group of researchers published the discovery of the world's earliest stone tools at a site called Lomekwi in Kenya, dating to about 3.3 million years old. And this discovery predates the earliest known fossils of Homo habilis by a substantial amount. So it seems like the tools would have had to have been made by Australopithecus or yet another related species that we're not aware of yet. This shouldn't be too surprising. Jane Goodall first published her findings about chimpanzees using digging sticks to fish for termites back in 1964. And since then, the evidence for tool use by non-human species has really stacked up. It's been observed in a number of primates as well as sea otters and elephants and crows. So we think that wooden digging sticks may have even been a precursor to these stone tools, but we don't have any evidence for them this far back because wood doesn't preserve the way that stone does. So part of the reason I'm telling you this is because I want to make a critical point that when we're able to see things archaeologically, what we're really glimpsing is the result of something that's already happened before many, many hundreds or thousands of times. And a behavioral threshold has already been reached by the time that we're seeing it in the archaeological record. We assume that when we make a discovery, it doesn't represent something rare or a one-off instance or the moment of invention, but rather a representation of the existence of a practice that has already entered into regular use. So Homo erectus was the first of our genus to leave Africa, although there were many subsequent migrations both out of and back into. But how did there come to be so many other species of humans outside of Africa prior to the diaspora of Homo sapiens over the last 100,000 years? And what is our relationship to them? So Homo erectus left Africa. We have dates for Homo erectus fossils in East Asia over 1 million years ago. There were different species. Now we understand, things like Homo heidelbergensis, of course, Neanderthals, right, emerging before modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerge around 200,000 years ago in Africa and leave about 100,000 years ago. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the out of Africa 2 theory proposed that while Homo erectus might have evolved into these multiple lineages outside of Africa, like Neanderthals, Denisovans, and Homo floresiensis, which was for a while popularly referred to as the Hobbit. But the estate of J.R. Tolkien didn't like that, actually. These are all considered evolutionary dead ends, and all modern humans derive instead from an ancestral population of Homo sapiens that originated in Africa and spread throughout the old world only recently 100,000 years ago. Under this theory, Homo sapiens basically outcompeted, outsurvived, or killed outright other species of humans. This argument has been refined and substantiated through advances in genetic sequencing and in biomolecular dating throughout the 90s and early 2000s. And we now know that based on DNA alone, the hypothetical origin for Homo sapiens in Eastern Africa is suggested to be between 100,000 and 400,000 years ago. So those 200,000-year-old fossils fit pretty well in that large estimate. So this is partially substantiated by those fossils, but it may be pushed back even further if we come upon older fossil finds or refine our genetic techniques. It also seems that a small population of Homo sapiens, numbering between only 10,000 to 50,000 people, left Africa as early as 100,000 years ago. DNA samples from living humans suggest that Neanderthals and modern humans separated from a common ancestor around that 400,000-year mark, even though we now know also that we retain about 2 to 3% of Neanderthal DNA in our genome. There's still some question as to what extent that's from this evolutionary split, right? What has been retained essentially from that earlier genome, but also what might have been added back in through interbreeding. And that's a big question now to understand, are these really different species if they can interbreed and produce offspring that then are also able to reproduce? It's still a big area of research. During the time of this split, importantly, let's not forget the environmental conditions. The world was deep in the throes of a glacial maximum, so an ice age, right? There was more than one, with cold conditions in Europe and dry conditions in Africa. The earliest Neanderthal fossils that we found are in the Levant. They too date to about 180,000 to 200,000 years ago, so about as old as the earliest Homo sapiens. It's reasonable to assume that there wasn't much population mobility during this time, perhaps reinforcing the distance between our species. But as we entered the warm period just before the most recent ice age, around 100,000 years ago, this is when people left, things became a bit warmer and wetter. That's when Homo sapiens dispersed out of Africa. So genetic and fossil evidence are currently being combined to help us see that cultural adaptations began to supersede physical change in our direct ancestors. People have said, did we stop evolving? No, but culture began to replace some of the biological adaptation in modern humans. These people, so in the second figure there, showing the dispersal of modern humans, had vertical foreheads, very rounded skulls, and a much more reduced brow than we see in the stereotypical kind of caveman depiction. They had that, they lacked the mid-facial projection that a lot of our earlier ancestors had, and a very distinctive trait was also the development of a chin. And it's thought that that's also happening because of food preparation. There's actually less need for all this musculature, you know, and for chewing. The mouth is actually getting smaller and receding, and the chin is emerging. The rest of their skeleton is less robust, and lower limbs were just as long or longer than the upper limbs, just like us. So they had modern body proportions. So even though they looked like us and had large brains like us, they don't appear to have begun acting like us until around closer to 50,000 years ago. So a lot of times we also distinguish between anatomically modern humans, these fossils we find around 200 to 100,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens sapiens, our subspecies.
What do you mean by acting like us?
So in terms of having symbolic behavior, creating art, which I'll hopefully get to, but yeah, so acting like us, sort of expressing, you know, evidence for burials even and things like that. And again, it's it's thought that these cultural and social mechanisms help them meet a variety of challenges that went well beyond physical adaptations like we see in other species. Cultures becomes really important. And what made us so unique as we spread throughout the world. So after leaving Africa and spreading throughout Europe and Asia, where did we go next? Perhaps as early as 65,000 years ago, we ventured into a completely novel environment, the megacontinent, formed by Australia, Tasmania, and Papua New Guinea, known as the Sahul. Once we landed there, we impacted the environment in extraordinary ways, arguably driving to extinction several species of megafauna, large animals that weighed in between 220 pounds or more, including giant marsupials and reptiles and birds, as you can see there. And, you know, as we know, one of the reasons Australia's fauna and flora are so unique is because it was geographically isolated. It was isolated up to this point for about 80 million years after it split from Antarctica. So kangaroos, wallabies, platypus, you know, these all come to mind. Humans did not, Australia was still isolated when we settled there 65,000 years ago. Australia was never connected by a land bridge, like we think of the North American continent being connected to Asia, right, during the last ice age. There was no land bridge ever connecting Australia. It was completely geographically isolated for those 80 million years. So in order to get there 65,000 years ago, we would have had to travel by boat. And it's also remarkable because this required, again, the cognition, the forethought of getting in a boat where you might not have seen land, right? So taking that leap of faith, or maybe it was an accident. we talk about that too. When they first arrived in Sahul, they would have found a landscape populated by all kinds of exotic species that have not survived to the present day. The ostrich-like bird, the Genyornis there that you can see in the left-hand corner, it weighed more than 500 pounds. It stood over 6 feet tall, basically a dinosaur. It laid eggs the size of a cantaloupe, about 2,000 calories per egg. So it would have been a great windfall. Wombat, the size of a rhino, the Diprotodon, there sort of in the center. Up to 90% of these species are estimated to have gone extinct by about 40,000 years ago. And that timing is sort of suspiciously close on the heels of humans arriving there, right? So these species had existed in isolation, everything is fine. Humans show up and they start to go extinct. Could the extinctions have been caused by us? And was it due directly by overhunting, killing these naive species, or was it that humans influenced shifts in the environment? Understanding the nature of our arrival in Australia is important because it's debated whether we at the time, had that mental capacity to kind of plan, to seek out new land, or whether it was by chance. And this question of cognitive advancement is one that we'll come back to again and again, because it's so important in understanding the unique development of our species. So I'll turn to talk about that aspect a little more deeply now. Yes.
Do you know how many people existed in the world at that time?
It's difficult to say. I mean, people have played lots of number games, but it's very variable. Yeah. Even the genetics, there's big ranges. So I'll start with some of the questions surrounding language. How old is language? What did it sound like in its earliest form? And was it necessary for the emergence of symbolic thought? And how can we see evidence for this in the archaeological record? As in many areas, DNA science increases our understanding beyond physical limits. The combination of fossil and DNA evidence could tell us something about where and when it evolved. But our attempts to grasp the full range of early human communication, including music and singing, is one of the hardest problems in archaeology. If we start with the body and view material culture as the embodiment of the human experience, I'm going to get a little metaphysical here, but our culture and our personal identity, then we can start to get at reconstructing things like mutual understanding and communication and the sophistication of cognition necessary for the development of language. So thinking about, objects as really the extension of the self. Material culture, we use this term to define, ornaments, tools, homes, art that we make, written records. It's all the stuff and things, right? It's sort of a catch-all term. So we think that as material culture then grows more sophisticated, so for instance, tools, right, become more complex, it reflects more complex cognitive behavior and capability. And as there's more different forms of material culture, this suggests that something's evolving in our brains. But when is there enough evidence for enough of this sophistication for language to develop? Art began to flourish and humans adopted intentional burial as early as about 45,000 years ago. And we can see this in increasingly complex toolkits and interpret it as behavioral modernity. But even if we view this as physical evidence supporting an argument for the existence of language, we can't necessarily prove it. All humans alive today are capable of speaking any language in existence. If we begin at infancy, we are able to make all the necessary sounds. It gets harder, obviously, as you get older if you're trying to learn another language. But biologically, that means that the human capacity for language evolved prior to our dispersal from Africa. It was part of the evolution of our original species rather than arising at one distinct geographic location and then spreading from there. And the case of Australia actually offers the best evidence in support of that, since we know that humans likely first reached Australia as early as 65,000 years ago and remained isolated for many tens of thousands of years until colonization. This lends support to the argument that the earliest Homo sapiens migrating out of Africa 70,000 years ago already possessed the biological and physiological capability for language. And fossil evidence suggests that this evolved even earlier. It's been shown that the ability to create most sounds in human speech rely on the shape of our vocal tract. So I have that image, that top image there. Our throat, it's uniquely L-shaped. It forms a 90-degree angle. In contrast, the closest living relative, the chimpanzee, you can see there in the middle, it spends most of its time on all fours. It remains this characteristic sort of horizontal arrangement, an obtuse angle seen in most mammals. And even human babies, so pictured all the way over here on the left, lack the distinctive arrangement of the adult's larynx, which descends below the pharynx in a vertical position. So infants possess this more horizontal structure that makes it possible for them to breathe and swallow milk at the same time without choking. So very good adaptation. But the fact that it's arranged that way is what prevents the formation of many sounds that a child will develop the ability to make later once they sit and start to walk upright. So it's no, sort of coincidence that infants begin to say words, right, as they're also starting to walk and be more upright. The arrangement actually changes in their throat. So it seems like this arrangement then, probably came around the time we started walking upright, like Lucy. So the physical, sort of foundation was there, right? It's then a question of when did the mental capacity come. So it's suggested that our favorite evolutionary cousins, the Neanderthals, who appeared again, as early as 400,000 years ago, were also likely able to communicate in a somewhat sophisticated manner. We don't really know. Researchers are trying to pinpoint this, and they're looking specifically at this bone that exists in our throat, the hyoid bone. It's a U-shaped bone that floats in our neck. And it's not attached to any other bone in the body, which means that it's also a lot of times not preserved or found when we're looking at human skeletons. So in point of fact, only one Neanderthal hyoid has ever been recovered from the cave of Kabara in Israel. It dates to about 60,000 years old. But however, because we have that hyoid, scientists were able to model the relative position of the hyoid in the Neanderthal neck as compared to ours using CT scanning. And they found that the Neanderthal's hyoid would have been slightly forward as compared to ours, and used this to argue that Neanderthals would have been able to make most of the same sounds as us with some exceptions. And so there's been a lot of more fascinating research with this, trying to simulate sounds and also looking at ear bones. What kind of sounds could they hear? But I won't, go into that. We can't really talk about the origins of language without wondering about the origins of music making and singing and dancing as well. It all seems to be related. What is the earliest concrete evidence for music in the archaeological record then? We don't know much about the origins of singing, but it's telling that the first instruments we found archaeological evidence for are wind instruments, so flutes that required the use of the mouth. So the cave site of Hohlfels in Germany has yielded one of the earliest known flutes. It was crafted from a griffin vulture bone, wing bone. So also, sort of an ideal bone for doing that. It has 5 holes at equal distance following the natural curve of the bone pictured there. And that's estimated to be about 35,000 years old. At another cave nearby, 3 more flutes were found, one made of mammoth ivory and the other 2 from bones of a swan. And those date to between 30,000 to 42,000 years old. So as archaeologists, we believe that any material evidence, as I said, demonstrates that behavior already existed, right? It's just one of many remnants. And so music making as a form of self-expression and group communication probably occurred long before we start to see this in the archaeological record. And likewise, our cognitive capacity and the ability to have complex thoughts and emotions likely existed before we could start to talk about them. So speaking of complexity, I would like to move on to talking a little bit about artwork and when and where that appeared. And if we define art as the modification of material for just aesthetic and not functional purposes, the first art probably emerged around 50,000 years ago. So interestingly, kind of again, coinciding with this good evidence for music making. And it's surfaced everywhere that humans are found, not just one geographical region. So again, this, sort of evidence for things happening simultaneously around the world. Early people around the world found ways to communicate with each other and express themselves through interpretive modifications of physical materials, from cave paintings to rock art and figurines. As with so many things in archaeology, our first example of something is constantly changing. So I could tell you something today and, maybe there's already going to be a study next week that's going to prove me wrong. But there's some, so case in point, there's some evidence of humans working with pigment actually much earlier than 50,000 years ago. There's no human remains discovered alongside the material at these early sites, but it's commonly accepted that we are the ones who did it, because who else would have? Yeah, that's the line of reasoning. So there's a constellation of cave sites actually in South Africa. And it's not, quite art, right? But at Blombos Cave, it's about 200 miles east of Cape Town, and it dates to about 100,000 to 70,000 years ago. We archaeologists found about 1,500 pieces of ochre, which is a naturally tinted red pigment. It's got hematite, iron oxide, and it's used again throughout the ancient world. A lot of times we actually find it in burials, but also in art. It creates a red color because of the rust. So these nodules of ochre that were discovered show wear from being used, and some of the pieces are engraved. And there's a piece of silkrete, a different kind of rock, that appears to have been drawn on with an ochre crayon, making this cross-hatched pattern here. About 73,000 years old, which makes it the earliest known deliberate marking by a human so far. Although again, there's no smoking gun. There's not actually human bones there. Not far from Blombos, there was also another unnatural accumulation of about 1,000 pieces of ochre at another site where there was a single piece that was also engraved. from between 50,000 to 80,000. So it's not just a one-off find, even though it is still sort of a rare find. Taken together, these South African sites provide evidence that the people who lived there possessed the cognitive capacity to alter an object deliberately, regardless of the meaning that they gave that object, right? But they did alter it. Now, in archaeology, we generally categorize art into one of two types, either portable or stationary art. So it sort of, the terms sort of define themselves, right? Portable art tends to be small, something that can be carried or transported. And stationary art is in place. Art can also be figurative or non-figurative. So again, maybe self-explanatory, but figurative art depicts a person or an animal, and art that's just, sort of squiggles or lines or whatever, right, would be considered non-figurative. So early portable art tends to be figurative and either zoomorphic, representing animals, or anthropomorphic, representing humans. Okay, humans, animals, two separate categories in our minds. When we see human forms depicted, they're most frequently female. About 200 anthropomorphic figures dating from between 40,000 to as recently as 10,000 years ago have been found throughout Europe and Russia, though notably not sort of other areas of the world. But one of the most fascinating examples of figurative art is the Lowenmensch, or Lion Man. And this is from Hohenstein-Stadel cave in Germany, and it was carved out of mammoth ivory. And it's really important because while the ancient Egyptians, we know, right, famously depicted their gods with animal heads on human bodies about 5,000 years ago, this predates them by more than 30,000 years. So again, the combination of human and animal features in this statuette shows our ability, humans' ability, to imagine something that didn't exist in the real world. The artist was expressing ideas rather than objective reality. So it shows us this cognitive ability to have complex thoughts exists, right? A creative mind and evidence of fully modern cognition, and that's about 40,000 years ago. In terms of stationary art, this might have been made less for aesthetic purposes, more for the sake of marking territory or wayfinding. Again, it's sort of open to interpretation. But many themes of the earliest art include food, the hunt, or fertility. This top right example here is an example of non-figurative stationary art. So this is the Cave of 100 Mammoths in Ruffignac, France. And we have thousands of squiggles, lines, swirls, undulating waves. This is known as finger fluting. In the early 2000s, researchers realized that these lines were actually made by children and not adults. So one of my colleagues actually, who we did our PhD together at Cambridge, she used measurements of finger widths belonging to children and adults and estimated that children between the ages of 3 and 7 made these lines more than 13,000 years ago. And they even found that one of the most prolific artists seemed to be a 5-year-old girl based on their measurements of the children. This phenomenon of finger fluting is not unique. It's not geographically limited. So there's examples in multiple other caves in France and Spain, some of them also by children. But it's also been found in Conalda Cave in South Australia, dating to about 20,000 years ago. And another example comes from the Indonesian caves in the Maros Panggep karst region on the island of Sulawesi. And in addition to finger fluting there are hand stencils going back about 40,000 years and a hunting scene dated to about 44,000 years ago, and multiple depictions of babirusa and warty pigs, which push about 46,000 years ago. And after the discovery of the art at this cave in Indonesia, this is currently the oldest, the world's oldest known cave painting. So I know people typically think of France and Spain, right, as the epicenter of this art, but actually it's occurring all over throughout the old world and even earlier in other places. So the geographic ubiquity and age of cave paintings and rock arts, again, begs the question to what extent these aspects of humanity and our modern mind predate our dispersal from Africa, and how deep are the roots of this creativity, essentially. So you might not think that you'd have much in common with someone who was alive 40,000 years ago, You might be right in most aspects, but cognitively speaking, people then were just as able as we are to have a conversation, carry out a debate, laugh at a joke, and so on. Okay, so how did we as humans first express ourselves in our culture? And when did the concept of fashion begin? Talking about art, what about, sort of self-expression? Genetic evidence from body lice suggests that we were wearing clothes as early as about 170,000 years ago. So again, close to the origin of our species. And by about 100,000 years ago, we were decorating our bodies with shell beads. So the earliest jewelry perhaps was sewn into, animal skins. The evidence for fine bone needles and weaving technology and even remnants of dyed and woven fabric appeared between 30,000 to 50,000 years ago. So again, coinciding with this emergence of art. So given these dates, it seems that we began modifying ourselves for aesthetic purposes around the same time. Obviously, clothing, protects us from heat, from insects, cold and wet. And it seems like this was a really early trait. But to what extent were people expressing themselves, through that clothing? We don't really know. However, we do have some tantalizing early evidence for modification of plant fibers, which could have been woven into fabric, which again falls into this time frame for the emergence of modern thought. So this is the middle picture here. This comes from Zudzuana Cave in the country of Georgia. These fibers have been identified and radiocarbon dated, it's most likely wild flax, to more than 34,000 years old. The pieces were highly fragmented, so obviously this is under a microscope, but really amazingly, when the experts looked at these under the microscope, they could see that the fibers had been worked and twisted, and also that they had been dyed pink, black, and blue. So there would have been no functional need to dye your fabric, right? It's highly likely then that this, is because people liked the color or wanted a color or needed a color, right, to identify themselves. They took the trouble to modify this from its natural form. And so that's really, amazing. This brings me to another topic. A lot of what we understand about how people adorned themselves comes not from obviously finding clothing, right? There's really scant evidence to find shell beads or flax this early. Much of that evidence comes from burials. However, from the earliest deliberate burials to evidence for cremation, we don't have very many remains of humans until agriculture develops. So up until the point where people become more sedentary and start settling down, it was actually very rare for people to bury their dead. And, we think that there's diverse practices, right, that we don't necessarily see the skeletal remains. If you were on the move, it makes sense, right? So if you're on the move, why would you bury someone somewhere where you're never going to return, right? You'd be more likely to want to carry them with you. And in fact, there's been some correlation made now with the rise of cremation and sort of our globalized society. People, don't want to be tied to one place. For the whole Upper Paleolithic period, which is about that 50,000 year mark to about 10,000 years ago, we have fewer than 150 total human burials for all those thousands of years, even though we have all this other evidence for, symbolic behavior, language, music, and art. So the first cemeteries appeared only after the beginnings of sedentism. However, when we do find burials, this is an early elaborate burial from Sungir, Russia. So, the artist's recreation of what they think this man may have looked like. Many of these individuals tended to have something special about them, showed that they died maybe from a disease, and may have been considered special by the people who did bury them. So there was very deliberate reasons for burying people. It wasn't the typical practice. So I'd like to turn to providing some context for the concept of sedentism, people settling down, at the beginnings of agriculture. If we stop to consider the caveman stereotype, why is it so prevalent, right? People weren't actually living in caves so much as using them. And really a lot of the interaction around caves was sort of at the mouth of the cave. Maybe they were using, sort of the entrance for shelter, but a lot of activity was also taking place outside of it. It also happens that, you know, caves preserve a lot better because they are protected than open air sites. So people might have been living, you know, out in the middle of a field, but we just don't know because we don't see it. It wasn't preserved. At Border Cave in South Africa, evidence of bedding has been recovered in archaeological layers dating as far back as about 230,000 to 183,000 years ago. These beds consisted of blades of grass and camphor leaves, which have insecticidal properties. And many of these beds appear to have been constructed on top of and mixed with ash layers that were probably remnants of previous bedding. And this probably doubled as another protective element from insects and also served for insulation. This phenomenon has been found at other caves in South Africa. I actually think a lot of exciting things are going to be coming out of South Africa for the next couple of decades, where there wasn't, you know, the ability to do a lot of the work there for many years. So we also have evidence for bedding around 77,000 years ago at another cave, Sibudu Cave. And you know, it shows that, again, even at these early dates, people were still modifying and adapting. They're not just like living in a cave, right? They're making a home out of this cave. The first rule of survival when you're out somewhere is indeed to construct shelter. So most camps were probably ephemeral and occupied for short periods of time and constructed of organic materials like wood that did not preserve. So far, the earliest evidence for built structures dates to about 100,000 years ago, and this comes from the Zambian site of Mumbwa Cave. The location of these post holes seems to be for a wall, maybe a windbreak. It was protecting sort of a semicircle of stones. But horse herders in Mongolia, right, to sort of contrast, right, they're also a mobile people, and they generally set up these yurts that don't even require post hole digging. So it could be that ancient people for thousands of years were constructing shelter that just didn't leave any physical evidence at all, right? So a lot of our best evidence comes from these cave sites where there's at least some preservation of building material that can hint at people modifying their homes, really. It's not until around 15,000 years ago when we have evidence for more significant built structures. And one notable example that I included here is from the site of Mezereik in Ukraine. So in 1965, a local farmer discovered the lower portion of a mammoth jaw and reported his find. Archaeologists came and excavated, and they found that there were 4 large circular dwellings. The largest measured about 26 feet in diameter, and it was entirely constructed from mammoth bones. In at least one of the structures, the mammoth jaws were used to create the foundation, and then there was probably like a wooden frame up around that with then skins. And at the time that these houses were built, about 15,000 years ago, the world would have been, you know, in the throes of the last ice age. It would have just been receding. Each structure used about 20 tons of bone. So it was the remains of about 95 mammoths. And this is not the only site with these mammoth bone houses in Ukraine. All throughout the river valley where that site was located, there are other sort of small villages. But notably, right, these are thought to be hunters creating these homes, not agriculturalists who we usually associate with building buildings and making villages. But we do have earlier evidence for that. Okay. I want to just rewind a little bit to this idea of the last ice age and what was going on, because there was also an important transition here where we had people coming to the Americas, settling North and South America. During the last ice age, a lot of the sea level was a lot lower, right? Because that ice was locked up in the ice caps. And so we had this land bridge, Beringia, connecting Asia and North America. This bridge existed between about 30,000 and 11,000 years ago. And it seems logical that this must have been when humans crossed over from Siberia into North America. Interestingly, for a long time, people thought that, you know, maybe people did cross over very early while the bridge existed, but that they didn't get down into North America, or I should say down into, you know, the present day United States until about 13,000 years. So there's this idea that there's this Beringian pause where people cross over into the continent, but they just kind of hang out in Alaska for 10,000 years because they can't go anywhere because of all this ice. An ice-free corridor doesn't open up here until about 13,000 years ago. However, the genetic evidence has recently showed that's basically wrong. And also, archaeologists have pointed out the fact, hello, we were on boats sailing to Australia 65,000 years ago. We knew how to make boats. People were, of course, yes, using the land, but it's much more likely that they're kind of hopping up, sort of island coast hopping, moving, migrating along this Beringian landmass, and then moving down along the coast, not waiting, for the ice to melt, so to speak. And so this line of thinking actually makes much more sense when we consider recent evidence. You may have seen in the news, there was a find of 33 human footprints at White Sands National Park in New Mexico. They date to about 21,000 to 23,000 and were discovered where they were formed in place. And these early dates have been supported by that genetic data. So we actually have humans moving into North America much more earlier than we thought. Okay, so key to the widespread settlement of the Americas was the end of the last ice age, which also played a role in the origins of agriculture. Those vast sheets of ice, began to melt by around 15,000 years ago. And by that point, we had made it to every continent except Antarctica. And those among our ancestors who experienced the shift were not unlike us today in terms of appearance or thought, right? They had this fully modern, established cognition. The planet was warming, sea levels were rising, landscapes were changing. And one of the most distinctive characteristics of this period is a continued rapid rise of sea levels, with coastlines remaining dynamic until about 18,000 years ago. So it's during this kind of critical post-glacial 15,000 to 8,000 year period where we start to see the development and emergence of early agriculture. We view this pre-agricultural period in the Levant not as a precursor of what was to come, but part of the agricultural transition. So it used to be very much so that, we referred to the Neolithic Revolution. Oh, people are just plopping down and starting to farm by about 10,000 years ago. Now we know this range of 15,000 to 8,000 is a much more realistic way to think about it, where there were lots of, changes that were happening gradually and sort of at the same time. So one question is, the Natufian people of the Levant collected grains that one day would become the cornerstone domestic crops of wheat and barley. But before they domesticated the wheat and barley, they were actually already using it to make bread. So it's this idea again of like, the first time we see something is not really the first time that people were doing it. Evidence of the first bread comes from the site of Shubakwa 1 in the Black Desert of Jordan. In a layer dating to about 14,000 years ago, archaeologists found 24 charred breadcrumbs from a hearth and looked at them under a microscope. So that's that top right picture there. And they could tell based on, looking at the particle sizes that the grain was winnowed and sieved and milled so that there were no big chunks, right? So that it was like a nice, you're not going to break a tooth. And they think that it was a combination of wheat, rye, millet, oat, and possibly barley. So people were already taking advantage of these grains and making bread before they started to domesticate them. The Natufians also figured out how to make beer. We have evidence of early brewing at Rakafet Cave in Israel about 13,000 years ago. So that's this picture here on the left. There were about 100 stone mortars up to 2 feet deep carved into a cave floor that were used for processing and storage. And interestingly, this brewery was situated among about 30 graves in the cave. Some of them were lined with ancient flowers, and some had animal bones. So it suggests that there's maybe some kind of funerary feasting here that's going on that's related to the beer brewing. While these early agriculturalists were domesticating plants and animals in the Near East, the reaches further north in Europe and Scandinavia were not really clear of ice. So there was no kind of scope for agriculture to develop there because the climate still hadn't shifted, right? It sort of warmed up and got a bit wetter further south earlier in time. And so we don't see this transition to agriculture occur in Europe and Northern Europe until much later. I also want to point out that the Sahara, it's the largest hot desert in the world, not somewhere we often think of the development of agriculture. But between about 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, so again, around the same time we see this development in the Near East, the Sahara was actually much wetter. It's actually called the Green Sahara, and there's books about that if you're interested. It's really hard to dig in the Sahara, so the archaeology is not that good, right? The archaeological evidence itself, because we can't get there now. But the little bit of archaeology that has been done has now shown that people were also starting to experiment with using grains and domesticating grains at that early date. So there's actually sites now in Sudan, Mali, Chad, that show there's also experimentation with these crops. So just to sort of sum up, agriculture, historically has been framed as a revolution, as I said, but its emergence was not an event. It was the result of thousands of years of process. At the end of the last ice age, those changes in global climate and environmental conditions made possible an extraordinary shift in the way that we obtained food. We had long survived by adapting to diverse environments, beginning with our journey out of Africa, across Eurasia, into Australia and the Americas. But this adaptation of agriculture was sort of unlike any that came before. It changed our relationship with the natural world for millennia to come. I mean, essentially, our modern world is the result of this, seismic shift in economy. So this transformation spanned the first steps of domestication of plants and animals to later full-blown agricultural economies. And again, for a long time, people thought that this was really the Fertile Crescent was the epicenter. We now know that, yes, a variety of plants and animals, sheep and goat, wheat and barley were domesticated in that Fertile Crescent, right? So that's number one there on that map. But less talked about is what the dawn of agriculture looked like across the rest of the world during that first half of the Holocene, our modern period, from about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago. So in present day China, for example, there's evidence during this time for the domestication of the chicken and crops like rice and millet, as well as the bottle gourd. The highlands of Papua New Guinea, not somewhere we necessarily talk much about, have also emerged as an independent center for early plant domestication. People were clearing the land and growing sugarcane. And you can see that's evidence of early irrigation there in that top picture. They were growing sugarcane, bananas, and taro root. However, interestingly, this did not coincide with the groundstone tools that we typically associate with farming in the Near East, where they're grinding grains. But you don't need a grinding tool to, eat a banana, right? So there's unique cultural adaptations that weren't really previously recognized that we're thinking about now. All this doesn't necessarily coalesce at the same time. Likewise, in the Americas, people in parts of South America domesticated a number of crops beginning about 10,000 years ago. This included maize, of course, corn, but also potatoes, beans, cassava, and cotton. And as early as about 6,000 years ago, llamas and alpacas and guinea pigs were domesticated in Peru. Interestingly, a lot of these sites with domestication in South America, they don't have ceramics like they do in the ancient Near East, because they're using their gourds as vessels. And they're also not necessarily living in villages. They're still living in caves. So this transition looks different all over the world, but it's happening around the same time. Also in Central America, of course, is another example of independent domestication of corn. So corn was domesticated more than once. And then we also have in North America, sort of less talked about or less thought about again, and probably a little bit later, but domesticated staple crops included sunflower, squash, goosefoot, and sumpweed. So, sumpweed, it's not a global commodity, but it's still remarkable that it was an independent center. So people came up with this idea themselves. They didn't say, oh, they're growing corn down there, in the Yucatan, right? So no matter where people were in the world, they were developing this new way of life. They were domesticating plants and animals and benefiting from having a stable food source. The presence of pottery and groundstone tools coincide in the Near East, and it used to be kind of talked about as the Neolithic package, but with this new, sort of evidence, we see now this is not necessarily the case all over the world. And in fact, some pottery has been found to predate any agriculture at sites in Mali. So these things are all just sort of happening, again, as I said, kind of during this time frame of 11,000 to 8,000 years ago, not necessarily all at the same time or in one epicenter and spreading. And people are adapting to their environment in unique ways depending on where they live. So, there's been this argument about whether agriculture was a revolution or an accident. I think that, the origins of agriculture can still be seen as a revolution when we consider this sort of backdrop of, 3.5 million years of history that I've sort of run through today, from Lucy and the earliest hominins in East Africa to the origins of Homo sapiens 200,000 years ago and our incredible journey around the globe since then. As new excavations and advances in modern technology allow us to explore the past in previously unimagined detail, some examples that I've hopefully given you today, it might be time to take archaeology out of the past and into the future. From understanding the origins of language and music to the fight for survival in challenging environments and the antiquity of our struggle to understand the meaning of life and death, we now have the opportunity to apply sophisticated science and powerful analytical methods in order to answer our questions about the trajectory of human history. And I think the next few years are going to be really exciting in terms of what we can learn by applying these scientific methods. But I also think with all this exciting methodology and new techniques, we need to not lose sight of what it means to be able to ask those questions in the first place. So sometimes people say, okay, but who cares about all this? That's interesting to sit and listen to for an hour, but why does it matter? And what my comeback that I always argue is that I think the most important defining characteristic of our species is that we have that consciousness, right? Whether it's a burden or a blessing, but we have that consciousness of the existence of all those that came before us. And that's really what makes us human, No other species knows that it has existed for 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years. And so it's really, our sort of, I think, duty to try to understand that existence through archaeology. So anyway, thank you for your attention. And as I said, there's this, the course is available on different platforms. And I'm also happy for people to follow up after the lecture if you don't get your question answered today. Thank you. Yes.
Can I just ask about 3 topics? Diseases and treatment, writing, the emergence of writing, and cultural continuity, practices that tended to last over significant periods of time, perhaps even into contemporary life.
So in terms of writing, that's much later and mostly associated with the development of record keeping. I gave this guy 6 eggs or a bushel of wheat, and then he gave me this back. That's really the earliest origins, but that's not until well after agriculture, so about 5,000 years ago. Cultural continuity, in some parts of the world, like let's say Australia is a very good example. There's a lot of Aboriginal communities there that, have been in place for tens of thousands of years. And they refer to this period of creation as the dreaming. That's their sort of explanation of the worldview. But a lot of it are these practices that, probably developed. Could have been thousands of years ago that have been maintained. And wildfires in Australia a few years back that happened, right, are a good example of this. So there was sort of routine burning in small batches by grandmothers who were sort of smoking out lizards out of their holes to eat. And this was like a very common practice, these controlled small scale burns. The Australian government, banned that in like the 50s, let's say. And as a result, there was all this overgrowth of brush in the outback. And that resulted in these wildfires. Now the Australian government's come back and like we do here, right? Saying, oh, we need to do controlled burns. But it's not at the same scale. They're still having issues. It's helping a little bit, but now they kind of have, guys in helicopters with flamethrowers burning an area, and it's still not really the same technique. So that's an example though. We think that, Aboriginal Australians were participating, doing this burning for like tens of thousands of years. Diseases, we're learning a lot about, I mean, we can look at the skeleton, but as I said, we don't have many skeletons. The earliest Homo erectus, or one of the best Homo erectus fossils we have, is a boy. Nariokotome boy is his, nickname. He's one of the most complete early Homo erectus. He was young when he died, like I want to say a teenager, but he even had back problems. So we can look at the physical fossils for that sort of thing. But more in terms of thinking about communicable disease, that's being resolved more through DNA and actually looking at the genetics of diseases themselves rather than like human remains.
Thank
Yeah, I'll get you in the back.
You mentioned that the southern part of South Africa has some exciting future research. I've been reading about Lee Berger's work with Homo naledi.
Mhm.
Has that work been, reading his book, I wonder if he's overstating the case.
I do think he is. I mean, I think that Homo naledi is a valid subspecies. But I think that the claims that they are burying their dead are unsubstantiated and not supported by what we know from other previous studies, the way that we understand, how do you tell someone's been deliberately buried? Right now, our best evidence for the earliest human burial is about 80,000 years ago of a Homo sapiens child in Kenya. And there's like a deliberately dug pit, So I do think that some of the finds are valid, but I think he's kind of gotten a little overexcited. Yeah.
I want to talk about agriculture. I mean, those couple of those dozen or so places where agriculture emerged independently at the same time period.
Mhm.
What the heck is going on? I mean, that 5,000 years is an instant in terms of even 100,000 years.
But it's because, and I didn't go into this, here, but it's most likely a very important change that happens with the end of the last ice age. The whole reason that the ice began to melt is because there was a shift. It has to do with Earth's orbit and other factors. But once that ice started melting, and again, so it does have to do with Earth's orbit too, in terms of distance from sun and how long, what part of the Earth is facing the sun. Okay. We actually had seasons develop. So before about 12,000 years ago, like during the ice age, the winters were cold and the summers were also pretty cold. And that's what led to the buildup of the ice, right? Then we had this shift, Earth's tilt changed a little bit, the distance to the sun in the summer was different. We got still cold winters, but warmer summers. And having this happen with these cold winters, warm summers, cold winters, warm summers, that led to this melting. And this led to this dependable seasonality. So really, a lot of the time that I talked about the Pleistocene, it's sort of this chaotic time in Earth's history where we have these ice ages, it's really cold, then we have these warm periods, it's really warm. It's not until about 12,000 years ago that we enter our current stable period. So we're in a warm period now, but we have this stability of the seasons. And I guess at that time, humans were sort of, poised, right? We had this advanced cognition, these tools, communication. We kind of had this
50,000 years earlier.
But it was cold. We didn't have seasons. We didn't have seasons,
But they were
basically.
still harvesting wild crops.
They were harvesting wild plants, but there wasn't that dependability. So we think a lot of what came around this time is that you knew you could harvest things at a certain time. You could rely on it being there then. Like a farmer now relies on like, when is the first frost going to be?
So all the humans all over the world decided at that time, oh, we'll have agriculture independently.
I mean, the conditions became ideal. The environmental conditions allowed for it, I would say.
Didn't all do it at the same year.
Well, but within a few thousand years in terms of.
And then it did spread quickly from those centers.
But they could observe that they naturally were doing that. The
Right,
crops
exactly.
were becoming- Oh, it always comes
Mhm.
in this time of year.
Right.
Do you know anything about communication between these different groups that dispersed different regions? I mean, in regards to Bill's question, maybe it was culture, maybe.
Yeah, and there is now thought that there's,
Somebody came and saw, oh, these people are growing things.
Mhm. well, there's thought now that there's more communication between like North Africa and the Near East than previously thought. One of the best indicators for there being any kind of cultural contact is if there's similarity in like the stone tools or the pottery. There's actually a practice when people, do start having cemeteries and burying their dead. around this time of agriculture, there's this sort of strange practice we don't understand of pulling out the front teeth. And so there's cemeteries in the Near East and North Africa where people have either one or both front teeth pulled out. And it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, or like it only happens at a certain age. So we don't really understand why people are doing, but it's happening like thousands of miles apart at the same time. So it suggests there's some cultural continuity there. But there are other groups that are not, there's not contact.
Yeah, but maize and wheat were domesticated at about the same time, right? And they-
But on two totally different,
they couldn't
continents.
have communicated with each other.
No.
I just want a better answer to that.
Well, if you watch my whole course. Was there another question or?
I was saying is that agriculture is a lot of work
Mhm.
as opposed to hunting and gathering. And so there's a lot of issues raised about why people would switch from one mode of production to the other.
Mhm.
I don't know if that question is well resolved or not.
Well, I think to some extent, there's been some discussion of once they did get into it, then it's kind of hard to reverse like the specialization and the intensification to then stop and go back. But there's also probably a lot more hunting and gathering still occurring that we haven't given as much credit to, I think. Like, I think archaeologists were really, a long time, there was this narrative because it also kind of fit in with this, a lot of these discoveries were being made the turn of the last century. So there's this whole thing of like the Industrial Revolution and, capitalism. And this is kind of like supporting those transformations that were happening in the early 20th century, like Marx is talking about modes of production and so on. And so I think scholarly attention was really drawn to like emphasizing the importance of agriculture, and everybody switched and became a farmer, when that's not really the case. There were still groups that did continue to hunt and gather, and even agriculturalists still incorporated lots of wild foods into their diet, but it was sort of ignored for a long time.
In some of the richest hunting and gathering environments seem to be to support quite dense populations.
Exactly. Yeah. You don't need, so that's another sort of I think, again, people were obsessed with like sort of demographic explosion and this idea that, they become farmers and then you can have 10 kids, and you could support this big society, when there can still be population growth under other conditions.
I have read that one theory is that it is related, adoption of agriculture is related to population density, and the fact that the earth is filled up at that time, there's nowhere to go.
It's sort of a like chicken and egg argument, because some people say population grew and then they needed to eat. They needed to sustain this population, and then others say agriculture developed and then population grew as a result.
I think having a bunch of areas and
Mhm.
and it just wasn't that space.
Mhm.
There were millions of Indians in this country still living in that sort of lifestyle.
Well, but there was also cultivation of these domestic
I know, but I'm saying
plants.
there was a lot of that, Plains Indians and stuff.
Yeah, the populations were probably a lot larger.
Millions of Indians.
Yeah, the population was larger than previously also thought, for sure.
Doesn't development of agriculture run in parallel with the establishment of cities and towns?
Well, it's
That would explain why you don't go back to hunting and gathering if you have a house.
It still is sort of a succession though. So early agriculturalists are probably, it's relatively, it's not that intense, and they are like in small villages. It's actually closer to that 5,000 year ago mark. So again, archaeologists like these amorphous ranges of time, but let's say from around 11,000 years ago, people are getting this more, they're becoming more entangled. They have this deeper relationship with the plants, whatever. They're making the beer and the bread, right? They're increased processing. Then they're maybe harvesting more deliberately and starting to cultivate and garden. Then they're becoming farmers. I mean, all that's kind of happening over the span of a couple thousand years. And then it's only when you sort of have more established village life and people are in these smaller units of villages, then you have this, it is a lot of hard work. So people begin to specialize, and there's craft production. You're a farmer, you're a crafter, right? You have your leader. There's sort of shifts in social structure that occur as it develops all sort of together. But the cities, the idea of a city, that's coming a little bit later, 5,000 years ago. And it is basically just a natural process of becoming, the process is becoming more intense, it's growing, and population is growing, and people are becoming more specialized.
What do you think?
Thank you.
Go ahead.
What accounts for this urge to just spread out and go everywhere?
I think we're just naturally curious beings, you know?
Population,
Part of a species, yeah.
population pressure,
I feel like with early,
escaping barbarians that are invading.
I mean, certainly there could have been like territorial struggles as well, like early on, we think, yeah.
That's why I asked about the population, because I know I've read some numbers, but, 20,000 years ago, there were just a few million.
And I mean, people have used genetics
There
to
was
try to
no
estimate.
plan for everything.
Yeah. I mean, it's thought that, I don't want to say like a number, but it is thought that like today's human population is descended from a very small number of people not that long ago, basically. So there was a lot of sort of local, extinction and replacement. But it's very difficult to estimate. A lot of it's based on complex models, and you kind of have to pick which one you want to support your narrative.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
What was your question?
Thank you. I was in Namibia
Oh,
and indigenous people are still knocking out their front teeth and painting bodies with gold.
oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
So what is the point of the front teeth? Is it just body, like, is it just for appearance?
It's appearance.
Because I know in some places they, with there's like the one tribe that does like the lip plate
Yeah.
for women,
right.
and like in order for the plate to sit right, they take out their bottom teeth.
Uh-huh.
So I wondered, like, was it something like that, like a pierce, like some kind of, or is it, yeah, just aesthetic group identification?
Very interesting. I found that to be.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
I have a friend that lives about 10 miles out of Johannesburg. You're keeping me up.
Oh, right, yeah, the South African stuff.
And so that's really, so this burger,